Yellowstone Bottom, Montana, August 1878. The cottonwood leaves had not yet turned, but a dry, insistent whisper in the prairie grass spoke of the winter to come. Most men were racing against that whisper, felling logs, mixing daub, and raising cabins against the inevitable siege of cold. Sigurd Haaland was doing something else entirely. He was moving his family into a derelict. The vessel was the Prairie Queen, a stern wheeler that had pushed too far up the Yellowstone on a spring flood 2 years prior, and had been stranded high on a mud shelf when the waters receded. Her paint was peeled, her railings were splintered, and her paddle wheel listed like a broken wing. To the other settlers in the narrow river bottom, she was a monument to failure, a boneyard of ambition. To Sigurd, she was home. Pierce Ainsworth, a retired riverboat pilot whose own cabin stood neat and square a half-mile downriver, watched from a distance, shaking his head. He'd piloted boats like the Queen for 20 years. He knew their bones. He rode over, reining in his horse, as Sigurd hauled a heavy sea chest up the sagging gangplank. "Haaland," Ainsworth called out, his voice thick with authority. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? That's no place for a family." Sigurd, a man built of the same dense, sturdy material as the ships he once made, set the chest down on the warped deck. "It is shelter, Mr. Ainsworth." "It's a wreck," Ainsworth countered, gesturing with a gloved hand. "That hull was meant to float. It'll heave on this dry ground. It'll shift and settle. The first hard freeze, that mud beneath you will turn to iron. The seams will spring wide open, and your family will wake up with the north wind for a blanket." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "It's a foolish, damned foolish thing to do." Other men, like Jedediah Stone and Marcus Thorne, who were helping raise a barn nearby, echoed the sentiment. The Norwegian was mad. A cabin was logs, chinking, and a stone hearth. A boat was for the river. To confuse the two was to invite disaster. Sigurd offered only a quiet nod. "I will see to the seams," he said, and turned back to his work. The mockery was quiet but constant, a background hum of certainty from men who knew the rules of this place. But what did this Norwegian shipwright, this skute-bigger, understand about infiltration sealing that a veteran riverboat pilot had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of those who survived against the odds. The story of Sigurd Haaland isn't just about a strange house. It's a masterclass in the physics of survival. If you stay with us, I promise you will learn the forgotten art of making a vessel not just watertight, but airtight, a principle that modern building science is only now rediscovering. Subscribe for more stories of frontier ingenuity, and let us know in the comments, what's the strangest dwelling you've ever seen someone build for survival? Sigurd Haaland was not a logger. He was not a farmer or a trapper. He had never swung a felling axe with the easy rhythm of the men who were now his neighbors. He was a man of the hull, of tarred oakum, of the caulking mallet and the paying iron. His hands were shaped by the specific curve of a ship's planks, his ears tuned to the unique resonance of a well-seated seam. He had come from a fjord near Bergen, a place where the North Sea wind drove rain sideways, and the greatest enemy was not the cold, but the water that carried it. For generations his family had built Scooter, the stout, broad-beamed coastal traders that plied the icy Norwegian waters. His expertise was not in stacking things, but in sealing them. He had brought his wife, Elin, and their 2 children, Lars and Solveig, to Montana with the promise of land and a new life. But their first winter in 1877 had been a brutal education. They had built a cabin as their neighbors did, a hurried construction of green cottonwood logs and mud chinking. The lesson had been delivered not in a single dramatic catastrophe, but in 1,000 small, grinding failures. As the green logs dried in the arid air, they shrank, At night, lying in the dark, they would hear the cabin tick and groan as the chinking pulled away from the wood, opening microscopic fissures to the outside. A fine powder of dust and frozen mud would sift down onto their blankets. The flour in its barrel, which Elin guarded so carefully, grew damp and clumpy, absorbing moisture from the air that condensed on the cold interior walls. Their small store of kerosene for the lamp seemed to change its very nature, the cold making it crawl thick and reluctant up the wick, the flames sputtering low and blue. They were never truly warm. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the heat roaring up the chimney while a constant ankle-high river of cold air flowed across the floor. That winter hadn't just been uncomfortable. It had been a slow, relentless siege that frayed their nerves and drained their strength. Sigurd knew he had failed his family. He would not fail them again. He had built a house of holes. This time, he would find a house with none. The fundamental flaw of the frontier log cabin was not its material, but its geometry. It was an assembly of hundreds of individual pieces, and every joint was a potential failure. The problem wasn't the logs. It was the gaps between them. Infiltration, the uncontrolled movement of air through a structure, was the great, invisible thief of heat and comfort. Men like Pierce Ainsworth understood insulation in a basic way. A thick wall is warmer than a thin one. But they didn't understand airtightness. Air, behaving like a fluid, will exploit any pressure differential. The rising column of hot air in a cabin's chimney creates a powerful negative pressure inside, known as the stack effect. This pressure actively sucks cold air in through every available opening. A single 1/8 inch gap running the 10-foot length of a log is equivalent to a 15 square inch hole punched directly through the wall. A typical cabin, with its ill-fitting door, single-pane window, and hundreds of feet of chinking, had the equivalent of a front door left wide open all day, all night. The chinking itself was the greatest point of failure. The mixture of clay, mud, and grass worked well in the damp climates of the East, but in the dry, high plains air of Montana, it was a disaster. The intense interior heat from the fireplace would bake the chinking bone dry, causing it to shrink and crack. It would pull away from the logs, creating a perfect, protected channel for cold air to pour in. Families would spend their winters constantly patching, stuffing rags and moss into the ever-appearing cracks, fighting a losing battle against the physics of their own homes. The Ainsworth cabin, considered a fine example of local construction, consumed over 15 cords of cottonwood each winter. The fire was never allowed to die, yet 6 feet from the roaring hearth, a bucket of water would scum over with ice by morning. They lived in a small bubble of radiant heat, while the rest of the house remained in the grip of the cold. They accepted this as the nature of winter. It was a condition to be endured, not a problem to be solved. Sigurd Haaland, however, looked at these structures and saw not a fortress against the cold, but a sieve designed for it. He knew the solution wasn't a bigger fire, it was a better skin. In the late summer heat, while his neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and contempt, Sigurd began his work. He was not building a house, he was restoring a vessel. His first task was to inspect every inch of the Prairie Queen's oak hull. The boat sat on a massive foundation of hardened mud, tilted slightly toward the river. He crawled underneath, his face inches from the planks, tapping with his mallet, listening. He was listening for the hollow sound of rot, for the dull thud of a loose plank. The white oak, felled in some long-forgotten Ohio valley, was sound. It had been protected from the worst of the weather by its own sheer mass. Then came the ceiling. From his sea chest he retrieved the tools of his trade, a caulking iron, a beetle mallet, and hanks of tarred oakum. Oakum is a simple material, recycled hemp rope fiber, combed out and soaked in pine tar. But in the hands of a skute bigger, it was a miracle of engineering. Starting at the stern, he began to work the seams. The process was a rhythmic art. He would lay a strand of oakum over a seam and tap it in lightly with the iron. Then another strand, and another, driving each one deeper, compressing the fibers into a dense, waterproof, and, most importantly, airproof gasket. The sound echoed across the river bottom, a steady, metallic tink, tink, tink of the mallet on the iron, a sound utterly foreign to this land of saws and axes. Pierce Ainsworth rode by one afternoon, watching the painstaking process. "You're wasting your time, Haaland," he called out. "That hull has been baked dry for 2 summers. There's no moisture left in it. The wood is shrunk. Come January, it'll be brittle as glass. You'll hear those seams pop like rifle shots in the night." Sigurd paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a tar-stained hand. "The sea heaves more," he said, his English clipped and precise. He turned back to his work, leaving Ainsworth to shake his head and ride away. He used over 100 pounds of oakum, methodically working his way along every single seam from the keel to the gunwale. He paid the seams with hot pitch, melting it in a pot over a small fire and pouring it into the packed grooves, creating a final, glossy black seal. Inside, he undertook his second innovation. He knew the oak hull, while airtight, was a poor insulator. He needed to create dead air space. Using rough-sawn lumber from a derelict sawmill upriver, he framed a thin interior wall, running it along the entire curve of the hull, about 4 inches inside the primary structure. He then began hauling bucket after bucket of dry sawdust, a waste product from the same mill, and poured it into the gap between the inner and outer walls. The sawdust was his insulation, his buffer against conductive heat loss. His neighbors insulated with mass, with thick logs. Sigurd was insulating with air trapped in a matrix of wood fiber. To his wife, Elin, the transformation was bewildering. "It is a strange house, Sigurd," she said one evening, looking at the curved, sawdust-filled walls of what was once the main cargo hold. He ran his hand over the smooth inner planks. "It is a good ship, Elin," he replied. "A good ship keeps out the sea. It will keep out the winter." He sealed every opening. The portholes were small and round, their thick glass set in brass frames that could be tightened down against rubber gaskets. The main hatch had a heavy sill and a door that closed with the satisfying thud of a bank vault. He wasn't just closing a door, he was sealing an aperture. By the time the first snows flew in October, the Prairie Queen was no longer a wreck, it was a bottle, and Sigurd Haaland had put the cork in it. To understand why Sigurd Haaland's strange boathouse worked, you have to understand the fundamental physics of heat loss. A home in winter loses heat in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The settlers understood conduction instinctively. Heat travels through solid objects, so a thicker wall slows this process. They understood radiation. You feel the heat of a fire on your face. But they fundamentally misunderstood convection, which for them was the most destructive of the 3. Convection is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, like air. Infiltration, the uncontrolled leakage of air, is a form of forced convection. It is the single greatest source of heat loss in a poorly built structure. Sigurd's entire strategy was an assault on infiltration. His first line of defense, the caulked oak hull, was the key. Oakum was a material born of the sea, designed to work in concert with the wood around it. Unlike mud chinking, which shrinks when it dries, oakum fibers swell slightly as they absorb ambient moisture from the air, tightening the seal over time. When driven into a seam between 2 oak planks, the pressure is immense. The tar coating makes it impervious to water and rot. The result is not just a filled gap, but a continuous, flexible, and utterly airtight skin. While his neighbors' cabins were collections of logs with hundreds of linear feet of potential leaks, Sigurd's hull was a single, monolithic membrane. Air simply could not pass through it. His second innovation, the sawdust-filled double wall, attacked both conduction and internal convection. The 4 inches of sawdust provided an insulation value, or R value, of approximately R8, comparable to a modern fiberglass insulated wall. More importantly, it created a massive buffer of dead air. Trapped within the sawdust matrix, the air could not circulate, preventing the formation of convective loops within the wall cavity, where warm inner air sinks as it cools against the outer hull, a process that constantly saps heat. Let's quantify the difference. The Ainsworth cabin, with its constant drafts, experienced a full air exchange, every cubic foot of warmed air inside being replaced by a cubic foot of cold air from outside, roughly twice per hour. To maintain a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside against an outside temperature of minus 30 degrees, his fireplace had to generate over 70,000 BTUs of heat per hour just to combat infiltration. Sigurd's sealed hull, by contrast, likely had an air exchange rate closer to 0.2 times per hour, a tenfold improvement. His small wood stove, generating a mere 15,000 BTUs, could easily maintain a stable and comfortable temperature. He wasn't producing more heat. He was simply keeping the heat he produced. He had built a thermos, while his neighbors were trying to heat the entire Montana territory through their leaky log sieves. The true test came in December. A vast dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the northern plains, plunging the Yellowstone Valley into a profound and punishing cold. For 10 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night it bottomed out at a terrifying minus 36. There was no wind, just a heavy, silent, penetrating cold that sank into the river bottom and stayed. The very air seemed to become a solid, pressing in on the world. The river ice, feet thick, groaned and cracked with sounds like cannon shots that echoed for miles in the still air. For the settlers in their cabins, it was a state of siege. Inside the Ainsworth home, every ounce of energy was focused on the fire. The cottonwood logs, notoriously poor for heat, burned with ferocious speed. The family lived in a tight circle around the hearth, wrapped in every blanket and buffalo robe they owned. Beyond that circle, the cabin was a landscape of ice. Thick, opaque frost coated the inside of the single window pane, blocking all light. A rime of ice grew on the nail heads in the walls, miniature signposts of the cold conducting its way through the wood. The logs of the cabin popped and cracked in the night, the sound of the wood contracting in the brutal cold, further widening the gaps in the chinking. To fetch more wood was a painful, breathless ordeal. To stay inside was to slowly freeze. Inside the Prairie Queen, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. The small cast-iron stove in the center of the main hold glowed with a dull red heat, consuming seasoned hardwood at a slow, miserly pace. The air was still and quiet. There were no drafts. Elin found she could work on the main cabin table, 100 feet from the stove, without a shawl. The domestic warmth was proven not by a thermometer, but by a simple, impossible task. She was rolling out lefse, the delicate Norwegian potato flatbread. On the large flour-dusted board, the paper-thin sheets of dough lay perfectly flat, not curling or drying at the edges from a cold draft. The air was so placid and warm that the delicate dough behaved as if it were a mild summer afternoon. The smells of cooked potato, flour, and melting butter filled the large space, a scent of home and hearth that was utterly absent in the smoke-filled, drafty cabins of their neighbors. Their children, Lars and Solveig, were not huddled by the fire, but were sitting at the far end of the cabin, reading a book by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Its flame burned tall, straight, and unwavering, a silent testament to the stillness of the air. One afternoon, Sigurd climbed the ladder to the deck. The cold was a physical blow. stealing the air from his lungs. The sun was a pale, useless wafer in the sky. He walked to a seam on the sunlit side of the deck, where he had used black pitch as a final sealant. He knelt and pressed his bare thumb into the center of the black line. The pitch, which should have been as hard and brittle as obsidian in this cold, yielded slightly under the pressure. It was firm, but soft. A perfect thumbprint remained when he lifted his hand. The hull was not frozen through. The thousands of pounds of oak were acting as a thermal battery, holding the gentle warmth from within. It was working. The ship was holding its own. By the 9th day of the Arctic front, Pierce Ainsworth was facing a crisis. His woodpile had dwindled to almost nothing, and the thought of heading to the woodlot to chop more in the paralyzing cold was daunting. Worse, his youngest child had a deep, rattling cough. He needed to keep the cabin warm, but he was losing the battle. Desperate, he thought of the derelict Prairie Queen. He remembered seeing brass fittings on her. The bell, the railings, the trim around the pilot house windows. Brass was valuable. He could scavenge it, haul it to Miles City when the weather broke, and trade it for a wagon load of wood or medicine. He saddled his horse, the leather stiff and creaking like old bones. The ride down to the riverbank was short but brutal. The snow crunched like broken glass under the horse's hooves. The world was shades of white and gray, utterly silent except for the sharp, percussive crack of the river ice, adjusting to the immense cold. He saw the Prairie Queen sitting silent and dark on her frozen perch. There was no smoke from the galley stovepipe. The portholes were dark circles. He assumed the obvious. The foolish Norwegian had either given up and fled to a neighbor's, or he and his family had frozen inside. The boat looked like a tomb, a monument to a foreigner's fatal arrogance. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the powdery snow. He walked up to the hull, pulling a heavy pry bar from his saddle. He decided to start with a brass-ringed porthole on the main deck. He knew the metal would be brittle, the cold having seeped into its very molecular structure. He began to work the pry bar into the edge of the brass ring. The Vindication scene was not a confrontation of words, but a collision of sensation. Ainsworth's mind was braced for the biting, painful shock of frozen metal, the kind of cold that steals the feeling from your fingertips in seconds and leaves behind a deep, burning ache. He expected the glass behind the brass to be a solid block of interior ice, a cataract eye staring out from a frozen tomb. As he levered the pry bar, his bare palm slipped off the tool and slapped flat against the thick glass pane. The sensation was so alien it stopped his heart. A wave of distinct, undeniable warmth met his skin. It wasn't hot, like a stove, but it was the temperature of life. It was the latent heat of a living space, conducted through a quarter-inch of glass. The glass was not frosted over. It was perfectly clear. He pressed his face closer, cupping his hands around his eyes, and peered through. In the dim interior, he could make out the soft, steady glow of a single lamp and the small, dark shape of a child sitting at a table, reading a book. Ainsworth staggered back as if he'd touched a live coal. Everything he knew about winter, about shelter, about survival, was wrong. He had come to scavenge a grave and found a living room instead. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then, humbled and awestruck, he walked to the main hatch and knocked on the heavy wood. The bolts scraped from inside, and the hatch swung open. Sigurd Haaland stood there, framed in the soft, warm light. He wore a simple wool shirt, his sleeves rolled up. Behind him, Ainsworth could feel the gentle exhalation of warm, still air, carrying the scent of baking. He was speechless. "My God, Haaland," Ainsworth finally managed, his own breath pluming in a thick white cloud. He looked from Sigurd to the warm, quiet space behind him, then back again. "You didn't settle a wreck." He searched for the right words, a concept big enough to hold the reality of what he was seeing. You built an island. Sigurd simply nodded, his expression calm. Come in, mister. Ainsworth, he said. It is cold out. Pierce Ainsworth did more than accept a cup of coffee. He stayed for 2 hours, walking the length of the hold, touching the warm inner walls, holding his hand over the steady, non-flickering lamp flame. He asked Sigurd questions, not with the arrogance of a critic, but with the humility of a student. Sigurd explained the oakum, the double wall, the principle of a sealed skin. Ainsworth became Sigurd's most fervent advocate. He understood that this was more than just one man's clever solution. It was a replicable system, a piece of vital survival knowledge. As a riverboat pilot, he was part of a network that stretched 1,000 miles. He knew how to disseminate information. He returned to his cabin and, by the light of his own sputtering lamp, drafted a formal bulletin. He sent it by the next postwriter to the headquarters of the Missouri River Pilots Association in Bismarck, Dakota Territory. He titled it, On Winter Refuge in Derelict Hulls, Observations on the Haaland Method. In clear, practical language, he detailed Sigurd's techniques, the methodical inspection of seams, the precise method for driving tarred oakum, the construction of the sawdust-filled inner wall, and the critical importance of sealing all apertures. He included temperature readings he had taken himself inside and outside the hull. He framed it not as a call for people to abandon their cabins, but as a life-saving emergency plan for pilots, crews, or settlers who might find themselves stranded near one of the dozens of beached steamboats that littered the upper Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. The bulletin was a revelation. It was copied and passed from pilot to pilot, from fort to fort. By the following winter, the crews of at least 3 other beached vessels between Fort Benton and the Dakota border had implemented Sigurd's sealing techniques. The phrase Haaland tight began to enter the river vernacular, a new standard for a shelter that didn't leak air. The knowledge spread, a quiet revolution in an old boat on a frozen mud bank. What Sigurd Haaland accomplished in 1878 was a century ahead of its time. Without any knowledge of modern building science, he had intuitively grasped and perfectly executed the concept of the air barrier, which is the absolute foundation of today's high-performance construction. Modern builders use sophisticated tools like blower doors to pressurize a house and detect air leaks, which are then sealed with specialized tapes, membranes, and expanding spray foams. Millions of dollars are spent on developing materials to achieve what Sigurd did with tarred hemp and sawdust. His restored Prairie Queen would almost certainly have passed a modern airtightness test with flying colors, achieving a level of performance that most new homes today still fail to meet. He proved that the enemy wasn't the cold itself, but the uncontrolled movement of air that carried it. There is a profound lesson in Sigurd Haaland's story, one that echoes beyond the principles of thermodynamics. The American frontier was a place that demanded new thinking, but the most powerful solutions were often born from ancient knowledge applied to a new and hostile context. Sigurd wasn't an inventor, he was a translator. He took the hard-won wisdom of generations of Norwegian shipwrights, a wisdom written in the language of wind and wave, and he translated it into the language of the prairie winter. What the sea cannot get past, the cold cannot get past either. The North Sea and a Montana Arctic front are 2 faces of the same relentless force. Both are governed by the physics of pressure, infiltration, and the eternal search for the weakest point. A man who builds a vessel to survive a storm in the North Atlantic already knows everything he needs to survive a blizzard in the Yellowstone Valley. He understands that survival is not about fighting the pressure with a bigger fire. It is about building a skin so perfect, so continuous, and so intelligent that the pressure on the other side simply ceases to matter. Sigurd Haaland didn't build a house. He did what he had always done. He built a ship and sailed his family through the depths of winter. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity and forgotten physics valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the way our ancestors solved the problems we still face today. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old world skills do you think would have been surprisingly useful on the American frontier? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and underlying scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone seeking to apply historical building methods for modern use should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.